talking about Dan Moody. And I'm going to let you kind of learn from him. But Ken wrote 2 books about Dan Moody some years ago. One was Dan Moody, You Can't Do That, Dan Moody. And that was the children's book from which the Palace Theater has adapted a play. The second one was Dan Moody, Crusader for Justice. And for those of you that aren't familiar with this fact, Dan Moody was actually named the Crusader of the Century some years ago by
Texas Monthly
because of his fight against the Klan. And those Klan trials took place exactly 100 years ago this year. And so this seemed like a very good way to start off our speaker series. And so as we go forward, we're hoping to plan some more. But for right now, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Ken and get out of the way.
Well, this is exciting. I thought we'd have 3. Although the last time I think I actually spoke at the Moody, we had about this many people here. It's been well attended in the past. So it's exciting to see that it's well attended now. And somebody managed to put a human being with a copy of my book in the front row. God bless you. I have 3 speeches ready to go. And I was going to give one of the 3 depending upon who showed up. How many of you do not really know the Dan Moody story? A few. All right. So that means most of you are vaguely familiar with the Dan Moody story. All right. I think what I'd like to do is pretend that it is August 31st, 1923. And set the scene for exactly what was happening in Taylor and Williamson and Travis County on August 31st, 1923. This may come as a surprise to you after listening to the histrionics of the weathermen for the last couple of months, but it was really, really hot in Williamson County in the summer of 1923. Now, they didn't have all the buildings down in downtown Austin that reflect, and they didn't have all that concrete. So I don't know that they actually were hitting 109 degrees or whatever they hit the other day. And they didn't have weathermen going, yay, this is great. Look how many days in a row we've had triple digits. But I suspect people thought it was hot. But as hot as it was, and even though we are right on the cusp of cotton harvest season, and I saw there some fields defoliated and looked like they're ready to be combined for their cotton any day now. This is a little early. It's a week early, maybe 2 weeks early for actual cotton harvesting. So that was undoubtedly on the minds of people, was the cotton harvest and the heat. But that's really not what was on their mind, because all anybody wanted to talk about was Dan Moody and the Ku Klux Klan and the trial that was set to begin in the courthouse on September 17, 1923. Now, my interest in Dan Moody began roughly 30 years ago when I was a district attorney. I was the district attorney. And since the time I was an assistant district attorney, and after I became district attorney, I kept hearing that Dan Moody was district attorney in Williamson County and broke the black back of the Ku Klux Klan. And there were all kinds of lawyers that wanted to tell me that in about the same words. And every time I would ask them a question like, what does that mean? What Ku Klux Klan? Why would there be a Ku Klux Klan in 1923? they would go, I don't know. So, I was a bright young man. What do you do when you don't know? I'm sorry, this was in the 1990s. What do you do when you don't know?
Go to the library.
You go to the library. Back before every library on earth was available to each of us with one of these. So I went over to the Georgetown Public Library and I said, I would like to see the biography of Texas Governor Dan Moody. They said, who? And then they looked it up in their card catalogs, you remember that?
Yes.
And said, we don't have one. Well, okay, it's a small town. So I went over to Southwestern University where they would have such things. And I looked in their card catalog and did not see it, so I asked. And they said, we don't have one. All right, small town library, small university library, wasn't really thinking that they shouldn't have it. But anyway, so I went down to the University of Texas. I didn't just go to the University of Texas, I went to the Texas History Center. And I went in and asked about the biography of Governor Dan Moody without missing a beat because they actually knew who Dan Moody was. They said, there isn't one. I said, what? I said, there isn't one. He said, there's a lot of Texas governors we don't have biographies on. I said, but this, I mean, he thought he kind of was involved with the Klan. It was kind of interesting. I mean, surely somebody's written a biography. And he said, no. So anyway, I got a little frustrated. And I thought, well, what the heck? I guess there's no biography of Governor Dan Moody, and maybe it's not that interesting anyway because nobody's thought to do this. So anyway, 1994 probably, I was geared up to run a re-election campaign, and I was positive that there was going to be an opponent, and we were working really hard, and nobody fought. So I thought, oh, I'm all dressed up, like, nothing to do. Well, I said you could like spend time with the kids. I did spend time with kids. But I also started researching Moody. And so the more I researched it, the more fascinated I got by it. So I literally read 7 or 8 years of the American and the Statesman, which are 2 separate papers there, morning and afternoon, on microfilm. I don't know if any of you have ever done microfilm research. It makes me nauseous. I can do 15 minutes at a time, and then I've got to come up for air. No searchable databases. I mean, you got to read every page. So anyway, a lot of time in the library. I did a couple other things. I started putting the story together. The more I got into it, the more I was going, whoa, how has this never been written into a book? So 3 years later, I thought, okay, now you've done the research, and I found the trial transcript from 2 of the Klan trials, which was helpful. What are you going to do with it? So I thought, okay, you've written some legal books, but that's different. I mean, this is a biography. You can't do that. And I thought, well, okay, so there's something called a young adult's biography. So rather than write the biography and then the young adult's biography, I played it safe and put together the young adult's biography. Well, that was satisfying and a lot of fun. It got me on book TV and a few other things, but the biography obviously had to be written. And so from 1997, when I came out with the first book, until I think it was 2008, when I finally finished the actual biography of Governor Moody. So that's sort of the background on how I got involved with this and what I know. Now, first question everybody has is, what Ku Klux Klan? I mean, if you think of the Ku Klux Klan, what's the first thing you think of? Reconstruction, right after the Civil War. What's the second thing you think of? Mississippi burning. Civil rights movement, 1950s, 1960s, fighting integration. How does that translate into the 1920s? But if you really paid attention in American history, remember there was a middle Klan. So let me give you a quick overview of the Klan. First, Civil War ends. 1866, the year after the war ends. Defeated Southern white people are really, really ticked off. And they form something called the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. They were a group of really, really nasty people who, had it not been after the Civil War, probably would have been thugs. They were violent, they were mean, they were just not nice people. Amongst other atrocities, they murdered 300 black people just outside of New Orleans one day, 187 in one county alone in Florida. Bad stuff. The Klan lasted 5 years before the federal government troops got rid of them. There was no Klan after 1871. After 1871, and after the Klan violence was done, and after everybody went to jail who could go to jail or otherwise stop doing this stuff, or at least into it, calling themselves the Ku Klux Klan, a myth developed, and it was a total myth. Had nothing to do with reality, about the noble Ku Klux Klan and how they had stopped Reconstruction. If you were a Southerner in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, certainly by the turn of the century, you know it to be the gospel truth that the only reason Reconstruction ended was because the Ku Klux Klan had stood up and those noble sons of the Confederacy had done their job well. It was just gospel truth and nobody questioned it. In 1905, there was a book written called The Klansman. Incredibly racist. And it took that story that everybody knew to be gospel and in the form of a novel told about the Ku Klux Klan. All right. The book was pretty successful, but nobody really cared about it because everybody who read it in the South and enjoyed it went, okay, well, we knew this. And everybody in the North didn't bother to read it. Okay? That was 1905. In 1915, D.W. Griffith came up with a movie called Birth of the Nation. It is the adaptation of The Klansman for the stage. Now, as a young University of Texas student who had some vague interest in film, I knew all about Birth of the Nation, not so much from the Klan perspective, but it was the first real movie. It wasn't a talkie, it didn't have sound, but by golly, when you watched it, you went, that's a movie. And it was the very first one. And it told this incredibly horrible story. And actually, it was designed for organ music. And the organ music really made it exciting. And I had a chance to actually see the movie with the original organ music being played. And it was darn exciting. And it was a technological breakthrough. And people couldn't, it just was incredibly popular. And they had no way to distribute it. So they made 30 copies of it. And they sent it to the 30 largest cities. And it played in the 30 largest cities in the United States until they stopped selling tickets. And then it went to the next 30 largest cities. And then it went to the next. It was a first-run movie for 5 years. 20, I want to get this right, it's either 20 or 25 million people saw this movie. I'm almost positive that figure's 25. There were 106 million people in the United States at that time. Roughly, well, certainly of the adults, a quarter of them got to see this movie. And this incredibly stupid, false, racist version of what the Ku Klux Klan was. All right. So in 1915, there was a William Joseph Simmons. He was a failed preacher in Atlanta, Georgia. Because he was a failed preacher, he decided, you know what, I think what I need to do is make a living. So he started working for the Woodmen of the World, which was a fraternal organization. And he wasn't totally unsuccessful and made a living. We should never know his name, except in early 1915, he was walking across the street in Atlanta, Georgia, and got hit by a car. Didn't kill him, unfortunately. Nor did it miss him, unfortunately. But he got banged up so bad he had to spend 3 months in the hospital. He brooded about his fate in life. And then he got an idea. He knew all about the Ku Klux Klan, and he knew about fraternal organizations. And so over 90 days, he just got his pen out and started writing, brought a pencil, and started writing and writing and writing some more. And he came up with the idea of the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. Wow, how cool is this? He came up with a lot of stuff that didn't exist in the original Klan. So suddenly, he had this idea for an organization where you could be a Klansman in a clavern and have conversations with your fellow Klansmen. All kinds of crazy stuff. He was, truthfully, a nativist, 100% white American, which wasn't an unknown philosophy at that, political philosophy at that time. And he set about to reorganize the Ku Klux Klan, and he was going to do it a special way because he wanted to make money. I mean, he liked politics too, but he liked being the head of it. He really wanted to make some money. So he came up with the idea of charging $10 a year initiation fee and $6.50 to buy probably a cheap robe. $16.50 to join this organization, and he was getting the lion's share of it. Well, like I said, he was a failed preacher and just a mediocre organizer, and so the next 5 years this didn't go too well. It went okay. I mean, he got a couple of chapters open in Georgia, a couple in Alabama, but that was about it. So one day in 1920, he walked into an advertising agency in Atlanta, Georgia. That advertising agency happened to have two of the best minds for advertising in the United States in 1920. Why they weren't in New York City, I have no idea. They were in Atlanta, Georgia. And they listened to his story, and they said, do we have an idea for you? First of all, you're making all this money, but you're not making much. So you've got to understand something, I don't know if they called it multi-level marketing, but that's what it was. And you've got to quit taking, are we getting feedback?
Yeah.
I think you're pretty good. I'm just turning this towards the dining room a little bit. Yeah.
I don't know, we'll keep trying. So, there's definitely some feedback there.
Sorry.
So, they sell him on the idea that instead of him getting the lion's share of the money, the salespeople will get the lion's share of the money. And after he signs off on this, they bring 20 salesmen and train them. And they said, look, here's the program. You go out to communities and you set up chapters, claverns of the Klan. You charge them the $16.50. You don't start a clavern without at least 100 members. When you get the organization going, you've got their money, you move on, and you're getting a big hump of the $16.50 yourself. Simmons is getting his share, but the lion's share is going to the salespeople. Suddenly this thing starts taking off, and part of the reason it took off was people knew what the Ku Klux Klan was all over the country. So 1920 on, the Klan got extremely popular. At its peak, they probably had 3 million members. Later in 1920, I believe it was September, one of the Klegels showed up in Texas because they wanted to see if they could break into Texas and perhaps do some mass marketing because they saw potential in Texas. So this guy named Upchurch shows up at some Confederate Veterans March and looks at it and says, yeah, this probably would go pretty good. So about 3 weeks after the Confederate Veterans March in October of 1920, the first Texas Klan was chartered. And by chartered, they had a cross burning, they had 500 members, it was in Bel Air, and it called itself Sam Houston Klan No. 1, which later became Texas Klan No. 1. Upchurch said, I'm not going to do this myself, and he brought in a guy named George Kimbrough, and he said, Kimbrough, you got all of Texas, you're going to get a percentage of all this, but you need other Klegels, and so Kimbrough trained 20 Klegels. Well, if they thought Texas might be fertile ground, it was very fertile ground, and within the next 6 months, they chartered 100 claverns throughout Texas. And just to make the point, the 100th clavern was in El Paso. So they basically covered the eastern 2/3 of the state and on out to El Paso, not so much in the Panhandle and basically not so much in West Texas, but the eastern 2/3 of the state. You can only talk bad stuff so long before somebody goes, maybe we should do something about this. So there hadn't been any violence because they were so busy organizing, but in 1921, I think it was February, the first act of Klan violence happened in Texas. And it was, and I'm almost 100% sure, it was a white lawyer who was accused by the Klan of representing the wrong kind of people. Bootleggers, gamblers. And so they took him out, they beat him, they poured hot tar on him and covered him with feathers. And that was in Houston. A week later, they went to the Adolphus Hotel in Dallas and found the black bellhop, and I'm 100% sure he was black, bellhop who actually made a fair amount of money as a bellhop, and they didn't like it. So they took him out and they actually seized him from the lobby of the Adolphus, so everybody could see this. Took him outside and poured acid and branded KKK on his forehead. Well, that began the reign of terror in Texas. So I think there are 52 reported, that we found in newspapers, reported incidences of Klan violence just in Texas in 1921. Now, before we get to El Paso Klan Chapter 100, we get to Austin, Texas, where Klan Chapter 81 was chartered. So it was in the first 100, and certainly within the first 6 months of this happening. Now they chartered and were kind of quiet until June of 21, when they decided to announce their presence to everybody by putting placards all around town, including one across from the Travis County Courthouse, which on that time was located on Congress Avenue. Well, the district judge saw the placard, and on Monday morning, as he was getting ready to send his grand jury out, I think their term was just about over, as he was going to discharge them, he said, I think I'll actually have them go investigate the Ku Klux Klan. And he issued a scathing charge to the grand jury to go find out what this Ku Klux Klan was about. And he told them it was outrageous that they were in our town, and blah, blah. Anyway, the grand jury investigated for 3 days and determined that the law enforcement agencies were doing a fine job. There may be crime, but it wasn't their fault. It was just a breakdown in morals. And this Ku Klux Klan group, there was no reason to think they were going to do bad stuff because everybody basically agreed with what they were saying. You know, crime's out of control, bootlegging's bad, loafers are bad, blah, blah. So that was the end of that grand jury investigation. Well, evidently that gave the go-ahead to the Klan, and they started warning people, and they started telling them to get out of town. I think there were 25 incidences over the next 90 days where they warned people to leave town. Some of the people in Austin were not happy about this, and as this was going on, the Klan had a clavern formed in Georgetown and one in Taylor. Some of the people in Austin were standing up to the Klan, and in particular, one lawyer decided, everybody knows where the Klan meets. They meet down on San Jacinto Street between 5th and 6th Street on Thursday evenings, so I'll go outside their rented Klan hall and take down their names. Well, it's kind of a cool idea, except the Klan guys weren't very happy about it. So anyway, that went on for a little while, and he got threatened, but nobody ever did anything until December. And he went down, he had some other people with him, and took names down and left. Well, shortly after he left, a man named Peter Clayton, who was 23 years old and had absolutely nothing to do with Shelton and his other people who were taking these names down, unfortunately drove down the alley behind the Klan hall. And when he did that, the Klansmen opened fire, and a hail of bullets riddled his car, and he was killed. Well, for the next 4 months, that murder case was investigated by the district attorney, by the grand jury, witnesses were called. 4 months goes on. And at the end of the 4 months, other than establishing, one, that the sheriff of Travis County was a Klansman, because he said he was, two, the Austin Police Chief and the Austin Police Commissioner were members of the Klan because everybody knew they were, and because they took the Fifth Amendment when asked. The grand jury finally realized none of these Klansmen are actually going to ever tell us the truth. They're either going to take the Fifth Amendment or they're going to lie. And they said, hey, you know, it's bad stuff. We can issue a report, which they did, but we can't indict anybody. That was April 26th, and Judge Hamilton was frustrated. The district attorney, Ben Robertson, was so frustrated that he quit. Ben Robertson was Dan Moody's cousin, and Dan Moody was county attorney of Williamson County at the time. And Pat Neff, the governor, had heard Dan Moody speak and thought he was a fine young man, and he appointed him district attorney. Well, Dan couldn't do anything about this any more than his cousin had, so he went about being district attorney. And he was an impetuous young man, and he probably spoke a little more than he was probably good, but he went and he told the Klan Cyclops that he was hoping they would find some Klan lawyer to run against him because he wanted to beat his butt. Well, they couldn't. So Dan got himself elected to a term, and evidently at this point, even though violence was raging around Texas, the Klansmen of Austin, Central Texas, had decided, you know what, this grand jury stuff isn't nearly as much fun as it looks, and maybe we ought to not go beat people up. So there was absolutely no violence from the time the Clayton murder at the end of 21. There was no violence in 22 in Williamson, Travis County. There was no violence for January, February, and March of 23 in Travis, Williamson County. And then it changed on April 1st, which was Easter Sunday. A traveling salesman was pulled out of his vehicle. He'd been warned to leave. He did not want to leave. In fact, went around Williamson County explaining he was going to kill the first 21 Ku Klux who tried to make him leave. Well, it wasn't 21, it was probably 8. It could have been 10, but it was at least 8. In 2 vehicles. One vehicle cut his vehicle off, the other one got behind him so he couldn't get out that way. He was in a vehicle with 3 other adults, another couple and a widow. And they pulled him out of the vehicle, pistol whipped him, took him to somewhere out in the country, chained him up to a fence post, gave him a severe beating, and then took him to downtown Taylor, where they were supposed to lock the chain around the tree, and then they poured tar and feather on him. Well, they remembered the tar and feather, but nobody brought a lock, so they couldn't actually do that. So they sort of tied it around the best they could and left him there as an example. I don't know how close he was to death, but anyway, this was a really bad beating. He managed to get the chain off, get across the street to a boarding house, and then something amazing happened because the sheriff of Williamson County was not a Klansman. He didn't actually like the Klan. His name was Lee Allen, and he was with a constable named Lewis Lowe, who also didn't like the Klan. And they went out and they did an investigation. Now, Moody at the time was tied up in trying a case down in Austin. It was a really interesting murder case, and it tangentially had to do with the Klan, but not really. Sort of a Hatfield and McCoy situation involved a shootout in downtown Sealy, and one family was more Klan and the other was less Klan. Anyway. So he couldn't get involved, but by May 1st he was involved, and he looked at all the witnesses they had interviewed, and he thought, well, what did Cousin Ben do? Cousin Ben had this grand jury proceeding, and it didn't work very well, so what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to have a grand jury proceeding, but I'm going to make my grand jury proceeding work. And he did, because he had a pretty good investigation. Plus, the Klansmen were so arrogant when they beat Burleson, they didn't bother wearing their hoods. So there were 3 adults, in addition to the victim, who could ID, or at least had seen them and possibly could ID the 8 assailants. So, everybody lied in the grand jury, or except the 5th Amendment. Moody thought, I don't know, see what we can do. Let's give immunity to people I know I can't prove the case against. And let's give immunity to Murray Jackson, whom I know I can prove the case against, but I'll only give him use immunity so I can still prosecute him. I just can't use the words he tells the grand jury. Well, he gets the judge to give them immunity. They go to the grand jury. They say, no, we're not answering your questions, even with immunity. And so the judge holds them in contempt, throws them in jail. Well, 30 days later, the grand jury is going to expire. They still weren't going to tell anything. And so 3 of them got out of jail. Moody came up with an interesting strategy. He managed to keep Murray Jackson in jail for another 12 days. And then the same thing that happened with Ben Robinson, except the one difference was Moody got the grand jury to indict 3 of them because they were the eyewitnesses and some other circumstantial evidence. So Moody had himself 3 indictments, and that's what happened in the summer of 1923. Now, everybody knew what had happened to the Klan in Austin, and everybody knew pretty much what had happened with the beating of Burleson. At least they knew close enough. So at the end of August 1923, when they weren't talking about the cotton harvest and they weren't talking about how hot it was, they were talking about this trial and what on earth young Dan Moody was thinking he was going to do, trying to Ku Klux Klan. Because absolutely nobody anywhere in the United States or anywhere in Texas had ever successfully prosecuted a Klansman during the 1920s. And that is the setting for where we are 100 years ago today. Now on September 17th, that trial began. And as you can imagine, I wouldn't be standing here and you wouldn't be sitting here if they didn't ultimately get a conviction on Murray Jackson, 2 other Klansmen, and then a whole bunch of Klansmen didn't want to go to prison, suddenly remembered how to tell the truth. And so they got a conviction on a Klan preacher who'd actually set this whole thing in motion for committing perjury. So Moody ended up with 4 convictions, 3 of the assailants, and the 4th was the Klan preacher who was basically the organizer behind it, and they all went to prison. All right, so questions? Yes?
Where does the name come from?
Which one?
Ku Klux. I mean, I've just never heard anybody say what the name meant.
Yeah, I'm not sure I answered to that, but if we Googled it, we might have an answer.
Get on my phone.
Yes.
You mentioned 3 clapboards, one in Austin, Sanderson Street between 5th and 6th, and then you mentioned one in Taylor and one in Georgetown.
Yes.
Do you know the physical addresses of those 2?
No, and they didn't necessarily have physical addresses. We think the Georgetown Clyburn actually met either out in the field or in a cave. And Taylor, I've never heard.
Okay.
Judge Stubblefield.
I will interject this. I do know that the charter for the Taylor Klan still is in existence and in the keeping of a family who was part of that Klan. And we've been trying to get them to let us have it for the museum. And because they have relatives that are listed as Klan members, we've obviously met with some resistance.
Lorraine?
That's another one, Ken.
I'm wondering what the social mixture, the social attitudes in Wilco were in 1923, and were there, obviously it was an extraordinary jury, and could you tell us a little bit about the makeup of the jury and how they managed to get 12 votes to convict?
Yeah, it's one thing for Sheriff Allen and Constable Lowe to have some guts to go out and investigate. It's another thing for the district attorney to actually follow through with it, but they all got paid for it. Maybe not enough to risk their lives, but they got paid for it nonetheless. It was kind of in their job description. I think about the 12 guys who got on the jury. Where was that in their job description? So, you know, I'm amazed they got 9 to 12 and probably all 12 of the grand jurors to return the indictments, much less that they got 12 people to actually follow the evidence and convict. So it says something about the fortitude of our predecessors here in Williamson County. Now, in fairness, there were no Klansmen on that jury, nor were there particularly any strongly anti-Klan people on that jury, because the lawyers all knew everybody who was on the jury panel. Williamson County wasn't that big. There was 6 defense attorneys and 7 prosecutors on the case, and between them and the sheriff and whoever else was helping the prosecution and all the Klansmen, they for sure knew who the Klansmen were and who the people who were most vociferous in their opposition to the Klan. So this was probably a pretty neutral jury that got seated, and people that had a bunch of backbone. Yes, ma'am.
So why don't you, I mean, if the Klan wanted to go after them, I'm surprised that they didn't try to tar and feather Dan Moody or
So was Dan Moody.
one of the jurists.
Yeah, well, I suspect Dan was back in heat, and I suspect the 12 jurors were too. Yes, ma'am.
I have a couple questions about your research.
Yes.
So one, you said that you were able to access the trial transcripts. Is that,
And I should put big quotation marks around transcript.
okay,
It took a lot of time to run them down. I knew they had to exist because the cases had been appealed. They were not where they were supposed to, but the person who realized they were supposed to be in his institution took exception to the fact that he couldn't find them. And so he and I both went and we ultimately found them. But evidently in 1923, a trial transcript was very different than a modern trial transcript, and I don't know when it changed. But today, if you're in a courtroom and I ask a question as a lawyer to a witness, they write down my question and the witness's answer. And if I cough twice. They're going to take 2 lines in that transcript because they get paid by the page. So nothing happens in the courtroom that doesn't get into that transcript. If the judge says, let's take a break, it's time to go to the bathroom, that's going to be 2 lines, and it's going to be recorded. The transcript, and that's what I was expecting to find when I opened these things up, but what I found was, Judge, what he said wasn't important, so it's not included. Lawyers, not important, no questions. And all the witnesses spoke in complete sentences. So evidently something happened in human nature from 1923 to now. So what I'm guessing is the court reporter took the question, which they answered yes to, and then just turned it into a complete sentence as a declarative statement rather than...
Clarification.
What did you see at that point? It just says, I saw. And if it was, did this upset you? Instead of the answer being yes, which is probably what the witness said, it said in the transcript, I was upset. So, but there's 2 of them that were actual jury trials that were the witness statements, I guess, are there. And then when you take the newspaper accounts, you know when they broke for the day, so you could at least figure out this was first witness in the morning, not because the transcript tells you, which it would today, but because. So, second question?
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
This isn't so much of a question, but my grandfather was D.F. Fullwood, and his brother-in-law was Jim Shaw. And Jim Shaw was, they were all from Taylor, and were dear friends of Dan Moody's. Jim Shaw was his banking commissioner. And he was, and I wish I had listened better as a child, but my mother told me a story. She was a little girl at that time, that Dan and my grandfather and my great uncle went out to some place that they were meeting here in Taylor. The Klan was meeting, and there was, I don't know if it was by the river or whatever, but there were trees that they could.
Y'all hear any of this? Okay.
There were trees where they could come up approach from another way and, walk up, and they were doing something horrible that my grandfather wouldn't say.
Yeah.
But he said that my grandfather just said how horribly he felt because it was 3 men unarmed watching something horrible, and they couldn't do anything about it except go home.
Yeah, if your family lived in Williamson County in the early 1920s, they had some involvement. Not necessarily with the Klan, they may have been anti-Klan, but they...
Well, Dan Moody was one of the 3 I'm talking about.
And they certainly all would have known Dan Moody.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. And
Tell me about your interpretation of the coverage that the newspaper gave. Do you think it was fair? Was it?
Yeah, they pretty much wrote down what happened.
Just okay, that's good.
The Statesman did a good job, the American did a good job, the Williamson County Sun, they probably had more detail. The Taylor Democrat, I'm trying to remember if I actually got a hold of too many of their copies, but
okay.
Anyway.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Did they have hangings back then?
Lynchings or hangings?
Lynchings.
Lynchings?
Yes. I remember as I was doing the research, and I can't remember which year it was a lynch-free year, and that was evidently worthy of a headline. We've gone 12 months without lynching. But the Klan didn't lynch. Yeah. Racists did, but they didn't actually need the organization of the Klan, I guess, to do that.
By the way, I looked it up.
Yes, and the Ku Klux Klan is a corruption of some Greek
word K-Y-K-L-O-S meaning circle, and then clan, of course, meaning kind of like a family thing. So
yeah.
Now I know.
Okay.
I'm going to say about 4 years ago, I was in Richmond, Virginia, my daughter given birth. I was at the hospital, and around 1 or 2 in the morning, I was holding my granddaughter, and then I looked out the window of the hospital, and I saw the Klan walking on the streets dressed in white and holding a light, and I was shocked. Richmond, Virginia, 4 years ago.
All right, so if you're interested in more, the Moody Museum has lots of resources. My book is available in libraries. I'm pretty sure you have my
We
book
have
for
copies
sale.
here.
That's probably the best way to find out more is to read Crusader for Justice. And actually, Dan Moody's post-Klan political career was pretty interesting too, because he ended up taking on the corruption of the Fergusons, which is how he got himself elected youngest governor in the history of Texas. So, yeah, I've really enjoyed this, and I'm
Thank you, Ken. I think that was a wonderful way for us to kick off our speaker series, getting back into it after the pandemic shut us down. We do want to recognize a couple of people that are here tonight that have joined us. In addition to thanking Ken, I want to thank Ann Moody and her family for being here tonight. She is the daughter-in-law of Governor Dan Moody. And Judge Billy Ray Stubblefield snuck in a while ago. And we have City Council member Robert Garcia with us. And we have several members of the Williamson County Historical Society. And I will tell you, if you have not come here to visit the museum, I encourage you to do so. We have an actual Klan robe on display upstairs. It was given to us by someone who said, I never want you to tell anybody where it came from. She said, I found it in an attic in a distant relative's home when I was cleaning it out.
In Taylor?
And I'm not going to tell you, but I do know that, there is more to the story. And we do sell Ken's books here. We also sell Patricia Bernstein's book here, which is $10 to Hate, which is also a history of the Klan and includes the Moody trial. We have members of our community who still have connections with all of that. I have a board member whose relative testified in the trial. We have, I happen to know it's a former student that has that charter that I'm trying to get for the Taylor Klan. But anyway, we are very, very glad you came tonight. We hope you will join us again for future events. And we didn't serve anything tonight. It's kind of hard in these crowded conditions. If you'd like some ice water, it's iced down in the kitchen. You're welcome to pick up some. And thank you again for coming.
Thanks for having us.